Tragedy struck Columbine High in Littleton, Colorado once again as school violence erupted suddenly and with...
The bodies have not been removed yet as vengeance was sought. It's 11:47 in the morning on April 19th, 1994. We are in Jefferson County, Colorado, United States. All television channels begin to echo devastating news. A shooting is taking place, but not just anywhere, it's at a school. These images start to flood everything. The helicopters from different media outlets arrive at the scene after noon. They will bear witness to the evacuation of some of the students. The shouting, the desperation of the relatives, the tension of the special weapons and tactics teams, everything will be recorded. They will even try to spy through the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of some of the attackers at 14:33. Then President Bill Clinton interrupts his press conference about the country's economic situation and refers to the incident. He claims he can't say much because they still don't have too many certainties about what is happening inside the institute. He appears worried and tense. Everyone watches closely, holding their breath. What neither the media nor the president know is that the attackers died a few hours ago, precisely at 12:08. Welcome to the Columbine special, the shooting that changed the world. It's hard to pinpoint the date when everything started to develop, but we have evidence that guides us. That a year before these two boys planned this massacre, they started talking about Judgment Day. The names of those boys have reached our days, wrapped in an indescribable aura that combines intrigue and repulsion. It was about Eric and Dylan Eric. He even talked about what they had in mind. On a website he managed and where he uploaded long reflections, usually linked to listing the things he hated. Yesterday he stressed that he would shoot everyone and leave no survivors. He even gave some names. He mentioned a certain Brooks Brown, a boy with whom he had had some altercations. He was concise when he wrote that when the time came he would have no mercy on him. This confession could have been the crucial moment that stopped the impending events from unfolding. And it is that it ended up being read by the parents of the threatened young man. The couple knew that sometimes teenagers could be bullies and they talked too much. But what was written there was something that chilled the blood. They didn't seem like empty threats or a simple discharge. It seemed more like something written by a disturbed person ready to fulfill their words. Fearing for their son's life, Brooks' parents spoke with the police. The officers took his statement and were even able to verify that neither Eric nor Dylan had a clean record. They even had a search warrant, but they did nothing. Brooks' parents insisted in vain. The last time they went to a police station was on March 31st, 1999. After that, they gave up and tried to convince themselves that they shouldn't be so paranoid. They didn't know that if the police had effectively raided Eric's home, they would have found all kinds of weapons with more than 100 homemade explosives. And with the plans of their school? It was the arsenal and the plans that just 21 days later would be used to carry out the most famous school shooting in the United States. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Why are Eric and Dylan considered martyrs by so many teenagers? What happened in those eternal 47 minutes in which they carried out their darkest fantasies? Is it true that they were kids who suffered from bullying? Why was it said that a poorly administered medication could have been vitally important for chaos to break out? What happened to the survivors? What attitude did the parents of the perpetrators take? What was the role of the media in this equation? This report will be enduring. We are going to present here a lot of data and a lot of evidence that does not appear in other YouTube videos, such as sketches, drawings. What did they write in their diaries, photos, videos? We got a lot of exclusive material that we are going to dump here, as well as for those who are interested at the end of the video, like a kind of post-credit. After everything is over, you will be able to listen. Complete the call to 911 from one of the victims who called this number while the two of them were still wandering around the school. This video is going to be special. It lasts an hour, or I think more than an hour even. So if you're interested that we do these kind of longer reports at least once a month, write the word special here below, because this is a special about columns. So if you want us to do another special, write that word here below and give us suggestions on what the theme could be. Well, I won't delay this any longer. Let's get started. Getting to know Dylan. Eric Harris was born on April 9, 1981 in Kansas, but quickly got to know various destinations in the United States. His father's job as a cargo pilot for the armed forces required the family to relocate to different bases for over a decade. This caused his family to have to undergo successive moves. These moves were not easy for Eric, who felt unable to form lasting bonds, and sooner rather than later became somewhat of a hermit. Knowing that making friends did not seem like a possibility on his agenda, he soon became devoted to video games and tried to disguise the resentment that was slowly beginning to eat away at him. When his father received a forced retirement, the boy finally settled in Colorado. It was July of 1993, and he finally had the chance to consider a place as his home. And things only got better because that same year he met another boy with similar interests to his own in elementary school. One unspecified day of that month, they shook hands for the first time, and the other introduced himself as Dylan Klebold. Unlike Eric, Dylan was a native of Colorado and was born on September 11, 1981. His father was a geophysicist and his mother worked with disabled people. In his early years, the young man had attended a school where he enjoyed a certain reputation. There he was part of a group oriented towards children with high intellectual abilities, so he received privileged treatment. He felt safe in that environment, and everything went well until they changed his school. His shyness did not help him fit into his new study center, where not only was he not considered special, but sometimes he even felt invisible. He persisted in trying and participating in various activities to socialize without going further. He was a Boy Scout and played on the football and baseball teams. As a result, he had met Brooks Brown, a boy we have previously discussed. Dylan and Brooks were very good friends for years. While they seemed to fit in with the rest of their peers, the truth is they were often isolated. No one seemed genuinely interested in hanging out with them, at least until Dylan met Eric. At 12 years old, that encounter marked the beginning of a relationship both young men would enthusiastically embrace. However, that deep bond would also escalate into a cocktail that would bring out the worst in each of them. The other key factor for this story occurred in 1995. When Eric and Dylan were already best friends and enrolled together in an institution they would come to hate. We're talking about Columbine. Dark years. The same year that Eric and Dylan entered Columbine, the place boasted of having invested more than $15 million in building a new cafeteria and a new library. It was precisely in those places where an unprecedented massacre would take place. Changing schools and entering adolescence challenged the friends. Dylan hurried to enroll in drama classes and was part of the technical team in many plays. He was quick at operating lights and the sound console, and that earned him some approval from his surroundings. Most people, as before, saw him as a very quiet boy. Things didn't get better for Eric, who had his first date when he entered the institution. He thought he would finally be able to forge a relationship with a girl, but the matter ended with her leaving him. The boy didn't know how to deal with that rejection and even faked taking his own life in an attempt to win her back. This, far from getting him what he wanted, made him become a freak in everyone's eyes. Brooks, who had also moved to Columbine, suffered a similar fate but stopped hanging out with Eric and Dylan as frequently. It was during these years that he began to feel something strange was happening according to his statements. Like many teens, Eric and Dylan found solace in their unique interests. They started discovering industrial metal bands and became interested in socially critical, highly violent cinema. They began to spend long hours looking for books on philosophy and politics, and they felt an early attraction to something that was coming to revolutionize the world: the internet. Thanks to the latter, they actively participated in debate forums, continued pursuing their passions, and excelled at some video games. In fact, Eric was a fanatic of Doom, a first-person shooter game for which he not only showed certain devotion. Eric was a restless enthusiast who soon discovered how to alter the original game codes to make it more explicitly violent. Around that time, the young man began to sign his works as Rev, a reference to his intention to be considered a rebel. Simultaneously, Dylan nicknamed himself Vodka due to his fondness for the beverage. Adolescence was looming over these boys, and with it came the hormonal and existential confusion that anyone who has gone through this stage has come to appreciate. Eric and Dylan felt misunderstood, they listened to loud music, stayed up late, got drunk, but nothing too far from what the rest of their peers were doing. At least that's how it appeared externally. Internally, things were happening, and even though they weren't the only ones receiving these taunts from the athletes of the chats, as they are now called at school, Eric and Dylan took it very personally, and a very, very dark hatred began to brew in them. The problems begin. Sometime later, when asked about it, their classmates said that neither Eric nor Dylan were as prone to aggression as one might expect, considering the way they referred to the rest of their classmates in their writings. But it is true that there seems to have been an episode that acted as a kind of trigger for something to break in them. Apparently, on one occasion, they were surrounded by the tough guys at lunchtime. Before they could do anything, the others had emptied many packets of ketchup on them, covering them in red liquid which gave the impression that they were stained with blood. Ironically, after that, Eric and Dylan convinced themselves that they were ready to be covered in blood, but not just any blood, the blood of their enemies. There are also records that at some point Dylan came home crying and went into the closet of his room with his childhood stuffed animals. He never wanted to tell what had happened to him. The boys started keeping diaries of their daily events, indicating they were not enjoying themselves. Dylan wrote poems, wondered about the future, said he felt unable to fit in, and hinted at his intentions to self-harm. Eric also felt weak but began to show other traits, somewhat more violent. In his trembling lines, he made it clear that he hated the bullies at his school, but also people of color, homosexuals, and women. Suddenly, friends started to have more and more things to share. Some tried to establish the idea that Eric began to manipulate Dylan during those years, but nothing supports that theory. Anyway, the teenagers doubled their taste for violence and started dressing in black, wearing trench coats. Before them, there had been a group of boys who had graduated from Columbine and called themselves the Trenchcoat Mafia. While Eric and Dylan were never part of this group, it's possible they were inspired by them to gather the courage to start challenging the rules. Relentless, the hatred that drove them began to emerge. Their first outlet was the cinema. The young men began to film their own short films, first as an assignment for a class and then for fun. In those fictions, they portrayed themselves as hardened thugs and flirted with prop guns. The tapes contained recurring mentions of killing, but no one viewed this as alarming. After all, is the United States a place where real guns can be obtained in the same place where fake ones are? A Walmart, as Michael Moore would demonstrate in the documentary he would later make about the events. Eric and Dylan began to exhibit more destructive behaviors. They would clog up the properties of teachers and other students, set off firecrackers in common places, and were quite fond of playing heavy pranks on others. They also insulted those who did not think like them and showed no respect for authority. They extended this problematic attitude to their work. In the summer of 1997, both started working at Blackjack Pizza, where they continued to have hostile attitudes such as setting traps for the unsuspecting and even starting fires. The pinnacle of those risque escapades occurred in 1998, when Eric and Dylan were arrested by the police after trying to steal what was inside a van. That marked a turning point, not because it showed the young men they were going too far, but rather the opposite. The authorities allowed them to avoid a serious sentence as long as they attended a youth program to prevent crime and control anger. Eric and Dylan had to admit to their families that they were going off the rails, and they complied with the request to the letter. They arrived on time for all the civic instruction classes and even wrote an elaborate and heartfelt letter to the owner of the van in question. In it, they committed to staying away from bad habits and were predisposed to take the path of good. The officers and other professionals analyzed them and came to the conclusion that they were rehabilitated, so they were discharged. However, neither Dylan nor Eric were sorry for what had happened. On the contrary, they had discovered how easy it was to deceive everyone and pretend to be innocent. This experience increased their self-confidence to do evil. It was then that they began to give life to a plan they called Judgment Day, the preparations. Eric and Dylan's anger became radicalized during that time. They began to show more interest in Nazi symbolism and thoughts. They became obsessed with serial killers. And they even analyzed other school shootings that had happened before the one they would carry out. Contrary to what many believe, Eric and Dylan were not the first to carry out a school massacre. They just wanted to surpass in deaths those who had preceded them. It is also incorrect what is believed about the date chosen to carry out their plan. According to a popular myth, they chose April 20th to commemorate Hitler's death. In reality, the young people wanted to carry out the shooting on the 19th and were delayed due to logistical issues. They chose the date to pay tribute to the Oklahoma City bombing. The Oklahoma City bombing was an explosive terrorist attack carried out in 1995 by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. The target was the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, located in downtown Oklahoma City, the capital of the eponymous state. It was considered the most serious terrorist act on United States territory until the September 11th attacks in 2001. The attack killed 168 people and injured more than 680. The motivation for the strike was to avenge the Waco siege, also occurred on an April 19th. In it, the police had stormed the complex that belonged to the religious cult known as the Davidians. McVeigh blamed the federal government agents for the violent deaths that had occurred there. At a certain point, Eric and Dylan stopped filming shorts and started using the camera. They had to make a sort of log. They aimed to commit a massacre and gain notoriety. They never mentioned seeking out their bullies specifically. They wanted to accumulate as many deaths as possible to be remembered for that. But for all that, something was missing. They needed weapons. Without wasting time, they began to look for them. Thanks to an older companion, they got some at a convention dedicated to rifle enthusiasts. Thanks to a friend of a friend, they were able to buy others in the parking lot of the place where they worked. With dedication, they built homemade bombs and acquired a few other gadgets chosen to do as much damage as possible. Dylan was becoming increasingly darker in his journals. Eric only dreamed of continuing to deceive everyone and then attack them from behind. He had even visited some doctors to satisfy his parents, which had resulted in him being prescribed a controversial antidepressant. It is believed that the young man's failure to take his medication properly, either by mistake or intentionally, intensified his inner anger. One way or another, they already had a plan and the tools to execute it. Nothing seemed to go wrong. However, there were several episodes that, if taken into account, could have prevented everything that happened. The signs that no one wanted to see. The website where Eric used to upload hate lists and doom tricks began to fill up with instructions on how to make a bomb. In addition, the extensive paragraphs which used to talk about revenge in an abstract sense became somewhat more specific. Eric spoke of specific actions, revealing a clear sense of supremacy in his speech. He believed that he and his friend were superior to others, that all the girls were self-interested and frivolous, and that their teachers wanted them to be dumb so they could be a good flock. They believed they were more aware than the rest and were willing to put an end to the whole charade. It should be noted that despite this public discourse, Eric and Dylan's diaries also showed another stance. Both separately agreed that all they wanted was to be accepted. They just wanted to fit in, have fun, have relationships, try to be happy. Above all, there was a swampy frustration in which they began to sink more and more. Eric's room, which was in the basement of his house, became their base of operations. Their final step into total descent was recorded in several conversations they also left recorded. These are 5 tapes in which they supposedly revealed much of what was going through their heads. Of these tapes, now known as the basement tapes, only a few fragments were made public. Investigative agencies warn that showing the material may be counterproductive and incite an uprising among some youth. That being said, the tapes were transcribed and then destroyed. The transcription of them will only see the light of day in 2026. It is known that Eric and Dylan dreamed of having a movie made about them in the future. Drunk on whiskey and vodka, they suggested names like Spielberg or Tarantino. They were convinced that they were forging their immortality, and in a very terrible and sad way they were doing it. Both boys' parents knew that when they were together, things usually ended badly, like the van incident, but they decided that they couldn't do much more. They also didn't interfere when Eric smashed the windows of Brooke's car in a fit of violence. Brooke's parents complained about it and they played dumb. They didn't want to accept that Eric was getting out of control. They also didn't want to connect the dots when they got a call from a gun shop saying that his order was ready for pickup. Mr. Harris simply said it was a wrong number. Things with Dylan were following the same course. Months before Judgment Day, his creative writing teacher had given them an assignment. and he had written a terrible story in which a teenager, whom he described with the same features as him and who dressed like him, carried out a massacre. The story was so explicit and strong that the teacher felt nauseous. After sending a copy of the story to the school counselor, she summoned the boys' parents. They insisted that teenagers were like that and that it was hard to understand them. That television gave them these images, but they didn't come out of their head as something real. In some way it made sense, because not everyone who writes about death is a murderer. However, the clues were piling up and seemed to raise no suspicions. The high point was when Brooks' family discovered Eric's page and reported it to the police. They also didn't connect the dots. The search warrant was not carried out and would later be hidden by the police, who tried to hide evidence of their inefficiency and instinct. All of this would come to light many years later, in one of the many trials that would take place. Eric and Dylan's accumulated material contained a comprehensive timeline of their planned actions at Columbine. They also explained how they would hijack a plane at Denver Airport to then crash it into a building in New York, perhaps the Empire State. They also filmed themselves shooting practice with friends. On April 17, 1999, 2 days before the tragedy, the prom took place. Dylan went with the girl who had helped them get some of the weapons. Though not a couple, they had a good rapport. Eric stayed at home bitter because he didn't have a date. His mother tried to console him, and he, in a sigh and far from his usual aggressive pose, mentioned that being a teenager really sucked. He would later attend the post-graduation dance party. There he and Dylan drank with many of the boys they would shoot at less than 48 hours later. Dylan even arranged with other boys to go see The Matrix on April 21st. This movie had recently premiered. The final recording on their tape would be a farewell. This happened less than 30 minutes before they began returning. Were their plans genuine? In the videos, they say they don't want anyone blamed for what's about to occur. They say they used many people who never knew their real intentions. They say their parents are wonderful and that they always treated them with affection and raised them in the best way possible. They also leave some of their favorite records to acquaintances in case they survive the massacre. Dylan concludes with a, "I don't like life too much and I'll be happier wherever I go, goodbye." Before the camera stops recording, Eric lets out a, "I can't help it." After that, they will stop recording themselves. The next time a camera captures them will be the security camera of the school cafeteria, where they will be carrying out a massacre. And that's how our story comes full circle. Minutes before the final judgment on Judgment Day, Eric and Dylan missed the earlier classes. Instead of going to school, they dedicated themselves to buying the last things they were missing. With everything in order, they headed to an area away from the school, where they set up bombs that would serve as a distraction. Then, at a time when they knew they wouldn't run into anyone, they drove to the school, each in their own vehicle. They went into the cafeteria and left 2 hidden bombs, each with 10 kilos of propane. They then left again and changed their clothes. One of them put on a shirt with the phrase "natural selection." They tied it around their waist and thighs. Several holsters with weapons, they loaded backpacks with ammunition, and under their trench coats, they hid the heavier arsenal. They had a Savage Springfield 67H 12-gauge shotgun, a High-Point 995 9mm carbine, a 9mm Intratec AB-10 semi-automatic pistol, and a sawed-off Stevens 311 500 12-gauge double-barrel shotgun. As we pointed out, they were able to buy everything thanks to an adult identification card. They didn't need anything else. Once prepared, they returned to school and stayed near Eric's car. The idea was to see how the cafeteria would blow up. To kill more than 400 people with the collapse and then shoot anyone who had survived and was running away. They wanted to see the world burn, and they assumed they had set the perfect trap. While waiting, Brooks, his longtime friend, stepped out for a smoke. Noticing Eric in the parking lot, he approached him. Despite their recent disagreements, he always remembered that at one point they had been quite close. Eager to chat, he asked the other why he hadn't taken the morning exams. As Brooks later recalled, Eric said that his dislike for him wasn't as strong as he had assumed, and that was what mattered, and that's why he wanted to give him some advice. The advice in question was to get away from there as quickly as possible.
They're walking through the halls, and you can see a wall of jocks coming at them. They come out of the street, it's their street, their world, and Eric and Dylan didn't come out of the street. And so you see the jocks put their fingers right on Eric and almost break the camera from his hand. And you don't hear them bitching because they're so used to it. They don't say, "What the hell was that?" They say, "Uh-huh," and just move on because it's so common.
Brooks left doubtful, not fully understanding. To this day, there are still people who don't believe that Brooks was entirely innocent. Even though there is no evidence against him, many argue that the young man plays a key role in several crucial points of the story. There are quite a few who claim that Brooks might have known about the plan, but didn't dare to be part of it. He also would have done nothing to prevent the catastrophe, which would make him an active accomplice. Either way, Brooks left and Eric and Dylan stayed watching the school, waiting for the big explosion. However, it never happened. Anxiously, they checked their watches. If they let time pass, the students would return to their classrooms and would no longer be gathered in the cafeteria, which would reduce the chances of killing them. They didn't know it, but the bombs they had built were defective. If this had discouraged them, today the story would be different. Quite the contrary. At that moment, they decided to opt for Plan B and set out to enter the establishment. It was 11:19 in the morning and everything was about to go irretrievably wrong. In less than 30 minutes, the media would repeat nothing but the word Columbine. The horror is unleashed. A boy and a girl were having lunch near one of the establishment's doors. After smiling at them, Eric and Dylan shot them. The girl died. She would be the first of many. The boy was seriously hurt but survived. After that first burst, Eric didn't hold back. He spun around and shot at other teenagers who were walking near the place. Dylan approached one of the fallen and finished him off with a shot to the face. 5 youths having a picnic near the parking lot looked towards the sequence, curious. Convinced that a short film was being shot and that it was all a setup by the audiovisual club. They realized their mistake when the bullets started heading their way. 3 came out unscathed, 2 were injured. Eric and Dylan encountered a teacher while walking towards the school. The teacher also mistakenly believed they were participating in a school activity. Filming a movie? She knew the matter was more serious than she estimated when the window shattered and a shot pierced her shoulder. After this, the woman ran to the library to hide and sound the alarm. A computer science professor and coach who was inside the institute heard the noises and acted quickly. First, he spoke with the Columbine security officer, warning him of serious problems. Then he went to the cafeteria, maintaining a cool demeanor. He ordered all the students to hide under their respective tables, not to panic, and to remain silent. It's likely that his quick work and that of 2 other janitors saved hundreds of lives. After asking the students who were there to take shelter in a safe place, the woman who had taken refuge in the library called 911. She never hung up, even after being attended to. So for several long minutes, the operator on the other side was able to witness the desperation that was experienced there. The first few minutes of this audio are the ones that were made public, and you will be able to listen to this recording at the end of this video. The security officer, coming from the opposite side of the school, was able to identify the attackers as they were entering. There was an exchange of gunfire between him and Eric before the young man disappeared into the building. A huge establishment that was about to become a hunting ground. Columbine turns into a hell. At 11:24, Eric and Dylan were rapidly moving through Columbine's halls, firing at the few students they encountered. They also broke glass and created loud noises with bombs, causing classroom doors to close in their wake. Meanwhile, the cafeteria started being evacuated. However, the attackers were not heading there. It is not known whether it was due to improvisation, practicality, or why, but they headed towards the library. The computer science teacher, who was dealing with the commotion in the cafeteria, went up the stairs to warn other students about a possible exit. At that moment, he saw the attackers and spun on his own heels, trying to flee at full speed. He would take 2 shots to the chest and fall, losing 2 teeth. With the little strength he had left, he would manage to slip away, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Another teacher spotted him and pulled him into a classroom where 30 more students were sheltering. There, they would provide first aid while placing a whiteboard against one of the windows that faced the outside. On the board, one could read, "Bleeding out." The idea was for the police and rescue groups to see that sign, who, from their own point of view, should already be nearby. And he was not wrong. The police had arrived immediately, but not knowing how to proceed, they simply waited for the specialized groups. They positioned their patrol cars to serve as shields against the shots from inside. When Eric and Dylan arrived at the library, they found that students and teachers were under the tables. With a firm voice, they asked everyone to stand up. They shouted it twice. Those shouts were heard by the 911 operator. At that precise moment, the teacher who had called dropped the receiver and was paralyzed behind a desk. The thunderous sounds of gunshots and explosions were still echoing in the place, just like the alarms and sirens. Even so, none of the 56 people hiding there could avoid hearing the slow footsteps of the approaching shooters. Without further words, Eric and Dylan fired another burst of shots, killing a young man. Then they put their ammunition on the table and walked towards the large windows that led outside. They spent a few seconds shooting at the fleeing students and the officers who were crowding around, not knowing quite how to help. Then they turned on themselves and looked towards the library, thirsty for blood. Massacre in the library. After shedding his coat, Dylan spotted 3 students hiding beneath a table. All 3 were injured. Meanwhile, Eric did the same and bent down to look at his future victims. He pulled the trigger several times, causing more deaths. Then he walked to one of the farthest tables and hit it, like someone knocking on a door knowing that there would be students underneath it. With great fear, showing great cruelty, he bent down and grabbed one of the girls by the hair. After uttering a phrase that is usually used when someone is found while playing hide and seek, Eric shot the girl in the head, but the proximity of his weapon to her face caused the recoil to hit him in the nose. This left him dazed and bleeding. At that moment, Dylan saw other students trying to help each other and did not hesitate to shoot them. His intoxicated friend waved his gun at the other boys' faces before focusing on a girl and asking if she wanted to die. The girl pleaded with him not to do it. Dylan pushed him to shoot, but Eric stood up without firing. Somewhat disappointed, the other one looked for a new target and leaned over a table where he found a group of athletes and a colored boy. After making several racist comments and unsuccessfully trying to get him out from under the table, they both opened fire on him and the others, creating new reddish stains. On the floors that had been immaculate until recently, Eric and Dylan continued their destruction, knocking over shelves, breaking more glass, firing randomly, and injuring and killing more students. Some tried to escape and one even tried to take down Eric with a chair, all in vain. The shooters were clearly at an advantage and showed no mercy. They mocked many of those who were trembling and asked many others questions like, "Do you believe in God?" before shooting them. They only deviated from this pattern with another student. It was John Savage, a boy they both knew. When Dylan came face to face with him, John asked him what they were doing. Dylan shrugged and replied, "Just killing people." John wondered if they would kill him too. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. After hesitating, Dylan told him to leave. John managed to get out of the institute. At 11:34, Eric and Dylan fired more shots outside. And then the survivors heard them say that they were no longer having fun. They even mentioned the possibility of taking out their knives and using them right there, but they didn't. They left the library at 11:36, leaving behind 10 dead and 12 injured. It would have been 7 minutes of horror. One question would become vital in the coming hours. Why, if they had enough ammunition, didn't they finish everyone off? That mystery persists to this day. Regardless, the young men continued to wander around the school, shooting erratically and without specific targets. They did not try to enter the closed classrooms, even though it was obvious that there would be more students and teachers hiding there. They went to the cafeteria, walked through corridors, and even returned to the library, but they only found unconscious students to whom they paid no further attention. Finally, 49 minutes after the shooting began, the perpetrators would fire for the last time. At 12:08 a.m., Eric Harris took his own life with a gunshot to the palate, while Dylan Klebold did the same, but from the temple. The first one died instantly, the second survived. According to his autopsy, he managed to inhale his own blood before his heart stopped. 4 minutes earlier, the first Special Weapons and Tactics team would have entered the place. These teams never knew that the attackers had taken their own lives. So they continued to act cautiously and silently for almost 3 hours, getting out all the kids they could. As a result of this sluggish rescue, the computer science teacher bled to death in the classroom where he had taken refuge. His actions and willingness to help others instead of saving himself are still remembered at the school, where he is labeled a hero. The school was finally fully evacuated before nightfall. It was later discovered that in addition to the cafeteria explosives, which could have caused the roof to collapse, several other bombs had failed. Eric and Dylan's cars also contained explosives. The ambulances and police were supposed to activate them, but they never did. The bodies that were left in the building were removed, including those of the attackers. By that time, they had already been identified. That same dawn, the agents began to check the rooms that had belonged to the two young men. That's how the material was gathered that allowed the reconstruction of the events, just as we have just presented them. In turn, new mysteries began to appear, but the big question that surrounded everything was why? Debates around the incident. Conservative sectors constructed the most unusual theories about the Columbine incident. It was said that the blame for the whole matter was on Marilyn Manson himself for containing aggressive messages in his lyrics. The musician's response was emphatic. When asked about the case, he implied that the culture of violence that was so attributed to him was part of the identity of the United States. He was precisely a sarcastic exhibitor of that very bad thing that was reproduced daily. Other artists defended him, pointing out that while Columbine was happening, the United States was also attacking countries it was at war with, who was then advocating for the use of guns. Bullying was discussed, and policies against school harassment were reinforced. Mental health also came into play when it was discovered that, as we said, Eric was taking antidepressants. But above all, the Columbine attack sparked debates about gun control laws. Many schools prioritize security by modifying their buildings and adding fences, surveillance, metal detectors, and shelters. Both even currently have armed guards and bulletproof blackboards. In many cases, students must have identifications to access the institutes, a task they perform through a single door. Emergency drills, previously mostly focused on fires, now emphasize response to a shooting. Even special weapons and tactics teams regularly train for these types of situations in institutes. Although all these measures seem to be insufficient for disarmament activists, the latter argue that as long as there is ease in buying weapons in the United States, tragedies will continue to occur. On the sidewalk, those who own guns argue that they have the right to defend themselves as specified by their country's constitution. One way or another, what happened in Columbine was widely criticized by everyone, or at least almost everyone. Gradually, many young people began to generate a kind of cult around Eric and Dylan, and not only that, they also began to imitate them. Columbiners. Often referred to as Columbiners, this online fandom is mainly made up of young people obsessed with the 1999 shooting. According to these youths, Dylan and Eric were merely sensitive martyrs, symbolizing all who felt unaccepted in high school. On one hand, this is a biased version. As we could see, Eric and Dylan didn't do what they did just because they were bullied. In fact, they had psychopathic traits. There are many groups that year after year emphasize the urgent need not to justify these murders. Much less should we think that they have a single explanation. Columbine is the sum of many factors. A cocktail that became lethal because it contained in its DNA much of what was swept under the rug of a nation for years. That many need to see Eric and Dylan as references speaks of how stormy they find the school environment. It's clear that there is a social atmosphere that is unhealthy for young people who must adapt to it. So there is a reflection of thinking that perhaps there was a reason for something as terrible as what these boys did. Given that they knew how to leave part of their thoughts scattered on the nascent internet, it's not surprising that Eric and Dylan have won over many of the early internet users. It's likely even that the cult to their acts and their persons is among the oldest virtual fandoms. It's also true that the morbid and the forbidden appeal to Trine. The fear that what happened in Columbine may have served as a sort of script for other potentially dangerous teenagers persists. To this day, The Conversation, a non-profit online news publication, has found that almost half of the school shootings, the perpetrator deliberately used Columbine as a model. The elementary school shooter. The Sandy Hook idolized the Columbine killers and created a Tumblr account in which he paid tribute to them, along with a graphic collage of the Columbine victims. A shooter from North Carolina was so obsessed with Columbine that he took a vacation there with his mother and fantasized about finishing off the wounded survivors. Multiple shooters, including a 15-year-old in Oregon and another in Washington state. A documentary about Columbine with detailed recreations of the events inspired them. A Wisconsin teenager took several of his classmates hostage after reading a book on the subject. The perpetrators of the 2018 Santa Fe shooting, in which 10 people died, wore black trench coats in tribute to Eric and Dylan. The list goes on and it's frightening. At the time of this report, the number of school shootings in the United States has risen to nearly 500. Since the massacre at Columbine High School, one unfortunate factor is repeated in all of them. More mystique is created around the attackers than an awareness of the real damage these attacks cause. To give you an example, many are unaware that those who survived Columbine were never the same again. Columbine overtime. Many of those who were in the infamous Columbine cafeteria and library continue to struggle with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Casey Ruxiger underwent more than a dozen surgeries. She spent the first few weeks in the hospital being harassed by the press, but also receiving countless support cards from all over the world. For a while, she suffered panic attacks at loud noises or the presence of someone dressed in black. While struggling with that, she faced the possible loss of her right arm. Eventually, the limb was saved thanks to a bone donation. The girl shared her experience in a book and travels around the country giving talks, trying to provide support and motivation for other victims of similar events. Richard Castaldo was left wheelchair-bound after being shot 8 times. He had to be medicated for the terrible anguish this caused him. In 2007, Joey Duran committed suicide after receiving death threats for being linked to the shooters. Austin Eubanks became addicted to the opioids he received during treatment to recover from the attack injuries. He struggled with addiction for years before succumbing to an overdose in 2019. The funerals of friends and acquaintances killed during the massacre were enough to cause a deep emotional impact on so many others who suffered. What is known as survivor's syndrome, a mental condition in which a person feels guilt for remaining alive after a traumatic event in which others died. These survivors often relive in nightmares that distant April 19th. Like in a loop, their brains bring them over and over again all the blood, death, screams, and chaos. They feel like they will never be able to leave those 4 walls where they spent the worst minutes of their lives. The heartbreaking aftermath of the massacre was not unknown to the parents of Eric and Dylan. Both families had different attitudes towards what happened, but they all agreed that they felt devastated and that they couldn't understand how they hadn't seen what was happening with their children. Both the Harris and the Klebold's made sure to send their condolences to the families of the massacre victims. This did not prevent a group of parents from suing them, considering them indirectly responsible for what happened. These legal actions came to nothing. The teacher, who cited Dylan's parents for his gruesome narrative in creative writing class. She mentioned that the boy's mother wasn't entirely sincere in looking back, as she believes she could have done more after her wake-up call. The police were also widely criticized for missing multiple chances they had to stop the perverse mechanism that had started months before the massacre. Yes, if instead of assuming that young people are inherently problematic, the officers had gotten involved in trying to find a solution, they probably would have noticed that Dylan and Harris's behavior was not just a simple tantrum. The tension experienced by the rescuers also had its consequences, even though that professional group is supposed to be prepared to deal with situations of such magnitude. Many pointed out that seeing teenagers between 15 and 18 years old crying and screaming like creatures made them realize how darkness can sweep away. Yet in just a few minutes, 47 minutes in this case, 47 minutes that continued to torment everyone with their unstoppable ticking. More than 25 years have passed since this event seared an era and consequently an entire generation. The massacre that occurred at Columbine continues to give chills for one simple reason: its causes and consequences remain relevant. Analyzing past events reveals similarities to our current experiences. In a world where cruelty increases considerably minute by minute, why are we so fascinated by what happened in 1999? Why did it have such a strong impact on culture? Why do books, movies, documentaries, and even video games that portray the last days of Eric and Dylan keep appearing? Why was even the chance of demolishing this institute evaluated to heal the wounds? Is it just morbid curiosity? What kind of reflection does this massacre give us every time it is talked about? Nowadays, the identities of school shooters are often concealed, with minimal details shared about their personal lives. Everyone fears that fascination with the figure of a killer will be recreated. However, with Eric and Dylan, it seems to be enough. They are destined to embody a prototype of an angry, frustrated, and marginal teenager who brings his most questionable desires to everyone's light, perhaps with a single reason: to expose a society that he considers hypocritical. Analysts believe that if Eric and Dylan had managed their anger, they would have graduated from Columbine before the tragedy occurred. And perhaps they would have gotten rid of many of the things that kept them from feeling fulfilled. Perhaps they would have gone to study at a place they liked more, or perhaps they would have found others with similar interests in film, video games, and music. Perhaps they could have felt that, after all, even though many things work horribly, can you live a life that is not crossed by hate and pain? They would have discovered that you can have self-awareness and confidence without having to subjugate anyone. Perhaps they would have even looked disapprovingly at those plans they had come to sketch on sleepless nights. Or maybe not. Maybe Eric and Dylan would never have fit in. Maybe in the end, that's what's fascinating. We will never know what would have happened if a minimal factor in this terrible puzzle was altered. We simply have the sentence and the obligation to review what happened over and over again, always looking for answers that will never be enough.
What's happening? Okay, we're arriving. The student. What is your name, ma'am?
So, shooting the kids at Columbine apparently is easier than fitting in at the school. The biggest lesson to learn from Columbine: